Hello and welcome to Philosophy Dialogues. Today we'll be discussing our own language use. Language is increasingly being seen as polarizing and political, and many believe it's being used to attack and create divisions rather than inform and unite. It's increasingly important to be aware of our own language use. However, to be aware of this, we must first understand what we value in language. We should ask ourselves how we should approach words and their meanings. And finally, how does power pervert language? I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Lily Schwalb. Um, and yeah, let's get into it. So our central question today is, what should we value in language? How should we approach words and their meanings? And finally, how does power pervert language? So when it comes to this, there's a few matters to clarify. Before we dive in, because it's a tricky subject, we have to be careful about what we're trying to achieve with language. Are we pursuing a hypothetical situation where we are trying to say there's complete anarchy or complete policing of language, or are we accepting a mix of both? And have there even been any examples of complete anarchy or complete policing of language we can point to?
So that's a great question, Dylan. From my perspective, true anarchy of language would have to be predicated upon anarchy of social interaction and anarchy of thought, just in general. And this seems impossible, given that within a social setting, an invisible or an implied set of rules will always be implemented. And so implementation of structure, even if that structure is not a rigid structure, implies exclusion of certain words in certain contexts. And so based off of that information, true anarchy of language doesn't seem possible. Also, complete policing would not be possible, given that thoughts cannot be directly observed by an outsider, and thus cannot be completely controlled on an individual level.
Yeah, as you said, you can never really have either extreme. They're more like hypothetical situations. So to argue for the existence of either in this discussion is kind of pointless. Sure, there have been some situations like where there have been stringent policing of language. Like we can see it in China. Currently, there's a social credit system that checks on what people can say. But even then, you cannot police people's thoughts. You cannot stop people from thinking. There's a great line from this movie, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's called The Trial of the Chicago 7. And I'll paraphrase it. But towards the end, one of the main characters is on trial, and he's been asking, what were you thinking going into this event? And he goes, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was on trial for my thoughts. That's not really something that exists. So we can't police thoughts, and even if we tried, we would at best be able to affect thoughts, not control them. But an interesting point I heard about this is, what if less people were using the language? And in that sense, it's probably a little easier to control language, especially back in more feudal days when there's illiteracy rates and the language usage, particularly writing, was centered around nobles. Nowadays, though, it's a lot different because literacy rates are much higher. It's not just written language, but we also have electronic language and social media. And it's a lot more difficult to police that, even though there is electronics, at least in my opinion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree that the addition of technology has made it much easier to have access to words and to language, and to understand language, understand meaning. And so I think access to technology, and specifically like the internet, has widened the scope of not only our own thought, but what we can express.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think there has been, when you have new platforms, that's new ways to police as well. But also with those additional platforms, that's more people using them, and it's harder to create like one central language usage. Like, I think it's interesting if you, even if you jump between different social medias, you'll probably see a slightly different culture in each of them. Because they've each like had their own little culture changes, I guess. But speaking of culture changes, actually, another important thing to clarify is, are we arguing for a cultural change or a personal change in word usage? And what I mean by that is, are we trying to say everything should change? Or are we just saying you, the listener, should reconsider the language that we're talking about? So what do you think about that?
So I think if we're considering the question, do we want an individual change or a cultural change? I don't see those as mutually exclusive. In fact, I see them as two ways of like two different approaches of solving the same problem. So obviously, a culture is comprised of individuals. So a way to change how we use language on a cultural level is by calling every single individual to change their language use. So in that approach, we are essentially going from the bottom up. We're asking or imploring every single individual to modify or consider the way that they're using language. And then another approach is a top-down approach, where we can call upon the entire culture and we can change the rules by which we implement and use language. And from that top-down approach, we're attempting to change the rules and the structure of the cultural level on which we use language. And then that filters down to every single individual. So those seem to me to be two different approaches that ultimately I would assume would have the same result, which is in fact a cultural change of language.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I'm not going to pretend like I'm powerful enough to create like a culture change in language usage. I'm just an individual. But um, we are making moral arguments. So we are trying to suggest that, I guess, not just the listener like you, but also everyone should do this. Whether everyone does that or not is a different matter. So in any case, I think we've got our matters to clarify down. Next, in this discussion, I think it's really important to figure out what our values are. So when we're talking about policing language or anarchy of language, that suggests that we like certain things. Like if we're going to police something, that suggests we're looking for something in our language. And usually that boils down to words. So when it comes to what values we would use for words, whether we like it or not, or whether we view that word as good or bad, um, I'm struggling to think of a whole lot. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so I would say two aspects of language or two aspects of words, which I think we generally tend to value, are uniqueness and specificity. And those two aspects of language, I think, are exemplified in two different approaches to language. And those two approaches are prescriptivism and descriptivism. And so prescriptivism is an approach to language which seeks to implement or impose a certain prescribed structure or a set of rules. And this set of rules is determined to be correct or good. The natural implication of prescriptivism is that there are correct and incorrect ways in which language can be used, and that language can be analyzed for its correctness through comparison to the prescribed and idealistic set of rules. The problem with prescriptivism, at least from my perspective, is that it is predicated upon the false idea that a uniform paradigm of language exists, and this can lead to unnecessary rigidity in the way that we view language itself. On the other hand, descriptivism is an approach to language which analyzes the way in which language is used at the current time. And it also analyzes the methods that it employs in order to achieve certain outcomes. And this perspective stands in contrast to prescriptivism. Descriptivism does not seek to compare existing language to a higher or more ideal form of language. Instead, it simply uses evidence from existing language to make claims about the way language currently operates. And so this approach is generally seen as more scientific in nature in comparison to prescriptivism.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I'm personally a fan of descriptivism. I think it's an easier method because, well, not so much easier as it is more universal. Because when it comes to prescriptivism, that prescriptivism basically requires you to have your own moral set of values. And what we see in the world today is that everyone has a pretty varying set of values. There might be some core values that unite us all, but when it comes to what we should like consider correct or good in language, I don't think everyone would just agree on that, which is why I like descriptivism's method, because I think people can agree on the effects words have, which is why I like the two values of uniqueness and specificity as things we're looking for, because I can't really think of any other values outside of those. Those seem like pretty strong values. Does this word, does it stand alone, or are there other words that basically serve this same role? And is this word specific? And specificity is also a really strong value to me, because when I use a word, I want to ensure that when I use it, people understand what I'm referring to. It's, it's specific. But I think there's a little more outside of just values. And I think what's more to words is the functions that they serve. So for me, I think there's some core functions that I look at when evaluating words. The first one is, does this word unite us or divide us? And also, many would just say, okay, uniting is the only function we should care about. And I would argue, not necessarily. Some words are actually meant to divide, and that has a positive impact for the speaker. But I think it's important to ask yourself, is unity necessarily a positive impact for the user of this word? So yeah, consider the goal, whether the goal of the user is to unite or divide. The second function is, does this word help you if you use it, or does it detract from the point you're trying to make? Now, all words have the ability to cause harm or do good, but does a word have a positive impact for you? To be clear, you may desire to cause harm with a word, but if you succeed in your goal, that's a positive effect for you. So it's possible to simultaneously value certain words for their ability to clarify and value other words for their ability to disguise, divide, or conceal. So basically, does this word in question fulfill its intended purpose, regardless of how you feel about it? At least in my opinion, yeah. You can value words for their ability to divide. I know it's kind of probably an unpopular take, but I'm curious about yours.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. I think words are only as good as the degree to which they fulfill their intended purpose, right? And so if the intended purpose is to divide, then, and if there's a word that fulfills that purpose, then we can say that that word is a good word within its context, right? It's within its purpose. And I think certain words, when they're used not necessarily always to divide, but to highlight existing divisions. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, because creating new divisions, creating a new fissure between two different sides is a bit different from acknowledging one that's already there that most people don't want to recognize or perhaps are not aware of. So I think that's an important distinction to make as well.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I totally agree with you. It's acknowledging the existing divisions. It's important to differentiate those two. But I also would like to add on that every word, and I mean literally every word, can cause harm. Whether by itself or in a sentence with other words, every word has the ability to have a negative impact to those people around the speaker. So to solidify these terms, I think we should take a look at some specific ones. So one word I want to take a look at is mansplaining. So immediately I can imagine for some people that has a whole lot of conjuring feelings, but I don't want to get political with this, even though it is probably to many a political word. I want to evaluate the effects of it. So I think you have you found a great definition of mansplaining. If you could share that, please.
Absolutely. So mansplaining, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is to explain something to someone, typically a man explaining something to a woman, in a manner that is regarded as condescending or patronizing.
That's a great definition. I think it's solid, and I think we can run with that.
I just also want to point out that the word mansplaining is a neologism. It's a new and recent term that's in the process of entering common parlance, but has not yet been fully integrated into the mainstream.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's part of the reason that people can have a strong reaction to it. I've seen it a few times where people have been like, "You're mansplaining," and whether it was true or not, the person accused of mansplaining um, focuses on the term rather than probably what was a valid complaint. And to give an example of that, I found this clip online that I think is really interesting. So take a watch.
You've restarted, let me just stop you so you don't waste a line of questioning. I'm just giving you...
I love the mansplaining. I'm enjoying it.
You're loving what?
The mansplaining that's going on.
What
Well, just talking me through how by not answering the question, by repeating processes which are not related to the question that I've asked.
What's mansplaining, Senator?
Well, it's the slightly patronising and condescending way that you're responding to my questions.
Well, I would suggest, Senator, that if you're putting the word man in front of some description of what I'm doing, you're doing that which I'm sure you're very much against, is making a sexist implication about how I'm conducting my role as a man.
Well, then the easiest way to do it...
Is that what you're saying, Senator?
Well, what I'm saying is that the way you've been responding to me has been patronising and condescending, and I have responded to that. So the easiest way to deal with this is not to have that way in responding to the questions I've asked.
Imagine the reaction, Senator, if I said you were woman-splaining. You're saying that I'm mansplaining.
Well, it is a term that's used.
Is it by whom?
Well, it is a term that's used.
By rude...
Doesn't make
by rude senators.
Okay. So to me, what's interesting about this, at least in my interpretation of events, is the woman explains her frustration with the man. Yet the man doesn't address the woman's reasoning about why she's making a complaint, but instead focuses on the term mansplaining and gets offended or defensive or aggressive or however you want to phrase it. Whether the woman's complaint was valid or not doesn't matter anymore because this guy has locked onto this term of mansplaining. So I guess, what was your interpretation of that?
Yeah, so I thought that the exchange was very interesting. And I think it's very clear that it's an example of ways in which miscommunication can happen, especially when it comes to neologisms. And I think this generally arises because the word is misunderstood by the recipient. So generally, when we are talking about communication, communication always involves two parties, the speaker and the recipient. And so the speaker ought to use the word which they believe would best communicate their ideas with the greatest degree of accuracy. And in comparison, the recipient ought to make the effort to fully understand the meaning of the term and the intention of the speaker in using that term.
Yeah, I agree with you there. That's why, at least with this series, I really love definitions. I call it part of your brain dictionary because that's, as you said, in any conversation, there's two people at least. And if you're communicating, but you don't have the same definitions in mind, I cannot imagine that conversation going anywhere like that one. It didn't really go anywhere productive. And as you said, the responsibility is kind of on both parties. If you're talking to someone and you use a term that they don't understand, try explaining to them. And I think the lady there in that clip, she did actually try to explain to him. And after that, the dude's still frustrated and angry. And then, so at that point, I think the blame cannot be based solely on the speaker, but it's also on the recipient's ability to understand this new term.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like how you brought in the important idea of definitions. And I think that's the crucial point with neologisms, because when neologisms arise, most people are not familiar with them. And so I think whoever is creating the neologism or whoever is first beginning to use the neologism, it's important on their end to emphasize not only what the new word means, but also what it doesn't mean. So if you only emphasize the positive characteristics of a new term, then other people may add on their own biases or their own interpretations when they attempt to discern the meaning. So I think it's equally as important to emphasize what neologisms do not mean, what they're not implying as well, when we start to use these new terms.
Yeah, I'm going to be completely honest. I'm not a huge fan of this term, um, but I think part of my like negative feelings towards it at times is like a lack of education. Um, and as you said, it's a neologism. By definition, it hasn't entered into the mainstream yet, so not everyone knows about it. Does that mean we should just stop using the word altogether? No, absolutely not. If if we just were like, oh, not everyone knows this word, so we should stop using it, no words would ever enter the mainstream, and English would stop being such a fluid language. And I like English as a fluid language. I think that's great. Um, so, yeah, I think in that clip, it was probably a bit more on the recipient side for that like breakdown in communication.
I'll just say I also definitely agree with the statement you made about having more education surrounding, neologisms and new words that are entering common parlance. I definitely think education is very important, and we need to. I think there's a trend that occurs when people become very familiar with neologisms because they use them very often, and they feel so comfortable with their own interpretation that they fail to consider the fact that there's a lot of people who are hearing that word for the first time, and those people aren't familiar with the definition, the traditional definition, or those people who are the recipients are not fully aware of the intent behind the speaker. No, the recipient is not fully aware of the intent the speaker is using when using that specific word. So I think it's very important to increase the education surrounding neologisms and to make people fully aware of the definition whenever you are using it just in general conversation. And that will help avoid misinterpretation.
Yeah, and as you said, education is super important for especially for neologisms. But before we move on, I wanted to run the term mansplaining through a kind of our test of both values and functions. So to me, I think this term is unique. I can't really think of any other word that serves the same function. I think you could probably replace mansplaining with a whole sentence, but the term itself is not really substituted by another single word. So to me, it's unique. Um, and it's also, I think, specific. It refers to one specific thing. It's not vague. Um, so I think it passes our two checks on values. However, when it comes to functions, I think it's a little slightly different. So, what do you think about the functions of mansplaining?
So I think mansplaining, interestingly enough, I think the concept of mansplaining has probably remained in the general subconscious for quite some time because it's not really exploring a new relationship. It's essentially highlighting a relationship or a concept that has existed for at least some time before it was explicitly codified into language. However, I do think that whenever you explicitly codify a concept that has been subconsciously recognized, perhaps, but never explicitly stated, I think that always, or not always, but it tends to give rise to some tension because there are people who often were happy or satisfied for that concept to go unnoticed or, unrecognized. And so I think whenever that happens, so a tension arises there. And I think that is one of the main reasons why we see this conflict arising whenever this word mansplaining is used. We can counteract this new tension that arises for the reasons I previously stated by, as I said before, increasing the education and by emphasizing the term, the meaning of the term when the speaker is using it, and then also increasing the understanding between the recipient and the speaker. And so the recipient would need to try to be more aware of the intent of the speaker when they're using that specific word.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And there's one specific thing I thought that you mentioned that was really important to note, is this isn't, this may be a new term, but it's not a new concept. So as you say, it used to be subconscious, and also I think it's in some sense conscious too, because I think men have been brutally interrupting women for a while now. It's not exactly a new phenomena, unfortunately. So you're probably consciously aware of this, as well as subconsciously aware of it for a while. But this word is kind of forcing it, as you said, into the general consciousness, which can create like divisions and frustration. However, I'd like to also add one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of this term, as stated before, is not because I don't think it occurs. I most certainly think it does. But I do think when you use it, you do run the risk of detracting from your main point. So I'm not saying that it's always going to happen like it occurred in that clip, but I'm saying I do believe that's a possibility. So am I saying just don't mention it, just keep getting interrupted? No, don't do that. But I think before maybe you throw that term in there, it might be a good idea to explain first what your problem is, and then maybe use that term. Because therefore, you educate first, which leads into the usage of the term. Whereas the lady in the clip there, she used the term first before mentioning before trying to tell him what she meant. But by the time she was telling him what he meant, the dude had flipped out. So that's not necessarily her fault. She's not responsible for other people's behaviors. But I do think that if you know you're going to deal with a situation where someone might be rowdy when you use a new term, it's worth considering going for education first before using it. And I think there's a really good example of someone who had to be aware of their usage of language before talking to people, and that person is Daryl Davis. Now, some people who follow this channel might know I'm a bit of a Daryl Davis fanboy. His name has come up before, but basically, if you don't know, Daryl Davis is a black musician who went into the KKK and ended up converting many members out of it through discussion and also sound reasoning, because Daryl Davis is a smart man. If you've ever heard him on the Joe Rogan podcast or something, he's very eloquent and he's very smart. So his existence was kind of a contradiction to all the ideas that the Klansmen had. So now I know I'm getting a bit off topic, but my point in this is that when going into the situation, Daryl Davis knew that he had biases that he was going to have to contend with. So as a result, he had to be careful in his language use. So not be offensive, not be rude. I'm not saying the lady was rude, to be clear, but just to be kind of hyper aware if you want to change someone's mind. It's unfortunate if people hold backwards beliefs, but if